It's time for some whiteboard fun. Hey everyone, Dylan Schumacher, Citadel Defense, and today we are here to talk about how our government works. So, if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that every once in a while we have to go to the whiteboard. And so that is where we are today. Recently, I heard today that the big beautiful bill, which is big, I don't know if it's beautiful, had the NFA provisions stripped out of it. So, you know, what was in there, in case you don't know, to catch you up here, they had a provision in there to remove short-barreled rifles and I think shotguns from the NFA, and also to remove the tax stamp requirement for suppressors. Maybe it was just the $200 fee. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was to remove them entirely from the NFA. But in any event, those have been removed from the bill, and they were removed by the Senate parliamentarian. Now, originally, I had missed that detail, and I just thought, oh, you know, the Senate ripped them out, typical government, you know, stupidity. But then I read a little bit closer, and I thought the Senate parliamentarian. And I thought, what's that? And so I did a little bit of research, and oh boy, is this a fun one. So stick with me here, because like all things government, this gets really confusing really quick, but we got to do some history here first. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to go back to 1806. In 1806, the Senate removed the previous question rule. Essentially, what this was a rule whereby they could force a vote. So they removed this rule. It was supposed to help things move along quicker or whatever, but essentially it doesn't allow you to force a vote on a topic. So you might have remembered learning about this in civics class as a kid, but there was a thing called the filibuster where you can just keep talking because they can't force the vote on the actual issue at hand. So they removed the ability to force the vote. This was suggested by Aaron Burr in 1806. 2 years later, by the way, Aaron Burr was the guy who shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel. And he was vice president at the time that he shot Alexander Hamilton in the duel. So a whole different side trail of history that we're not going down right now. But this is what happened. So this becomes important. So that's kind of the way that the Senate operates all the way until 1917. Essentially, they just talk until they're either talked out or until, you know, they figure out a way to come to a consensus here and move on, right? There was no way to force the vote. You could just talk about it forever, which honestly, probably how it should be. But all that to say, in 1917, they introduced and I don't know how to pronounce this, the Cloer Rule by a 2/3 majority. So in 1917, it's the middle of World War I. Woodrow Wilson is president, right? And they're trying to arm some merchant ships as they cross the Atlantic, and Congress is doing what Congress does, and they keep talking, and they got upset with that. So they introduced the Cloer Rule. Now, the Cloer Rule says that, hey, we can force a vote if we have 2/3 majority. So we're not just going to talk about this forever. If we have a 2/3 majority rule, we can force the vote, right? So something like 66 votes, give or take, right? If you had 99 people, it'd be 66 votes, but you know, whatever 2/3 of the majority is. In today's Senate's comprised of 100 people, in case you don't know that. And so it'd be 2/3, it'd be 66, 67 votes. So that was the Cloer Rule, and that was established in 1917. Now in the 1970s, and this is where some of my dates get wonky because I found some conflicting information here, okay? But in the 1970s, this is where things start to change. So in 1975, best date I could find, they reduced that to a 3/5 rule. So instead of 2/3, now you only need 3/5. Again, in today's modern Senate with 100 people, it comes out to 60 votes. So you only need 60 votes to move on and say, hey, we're moving on. We're not going to talk about this anymore. We're going to vote and we're going to move on. I can understand for those provisions, right? I can understand. I think it should probably be the 2/3, not the 3/5. But again, I get it to say, hey, we don't want to talk about this forever. Let's just vote and move on. Would probably better be if they talked about it forever, but whatever. I understand the procedural idea, okay? Now, again, best date I could find for this, 1974. So this is a little bit out of order, but stick with me here, okay? So in 1974, a year before they reduced that to 3/5 votes, they passed the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. Now, in the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, they said, hey, on a reconciliation bill, which has to do with budgetary concerns, we only need 51 votes. So before, it was, hey, we can talk about this forever. Now we can force a vote to 2/3. Then we can do it with 3/5. Now it's just 51 votes. Simple majority, and the bill passes. Now you might say, hey, well, why is that such a big idea? Or a big deal, rather? Well, the big deal is that when you need a majority, like more than a simple majority of votes on a Senate, it ensures that the debate is thorough. It ensures that it's a really good idea, right? Most people are won over to it, etc., etc. So to say, hey, we only need a simple majority on a reconciliation bill, you're reducing the requirement to pass that bill. And they said, well, hey, it's just a reconciliation bill. It's just bills that have to do with budget. But you already know how this story ends, don't you? So now, in 1980, you have an Omnibus Reconciliation. This is the first time that rule is used, right? So in 1980, they passed this big Omnibus Reconciliation bill. And that was the very first time they did it by a simple majority, right? This was under Reagan. I don't actually know what was all in this bill. I'm sure some of it was really bad. Omnibus bills are never good, okay? So some people were obviously upset about that. And it included things in there that were not just a reconciliation, okay? Because omnibus, that's a dead giveaway. But it included things that were not part of the reconciliation. So already this process got abused. So a couple years later, we have the Byrd Rule. So now in 1985, you get the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule is put forth by a senator, whose last name was Byrd, can't remember the first name right now. They were a Democrat, right? And they said, hey, you can only include stuff in this reconciliation bill that is reconciliation. You can't include these other items and stuff them in there and then just pass it by a simple majority vote. Like that's preposterous. Honestly, he's probably right? So the point of the Byrd Rule is that you can only include things in the reconciliation bill that have to do with federal budgetary concerns. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I also read something in there that you can't make any changes to Social Security. That was like part of the Byrd Rule, right? Which is a whole nother debate or discussion of how awful that is. But you can only vote on things in the federal budget. You can't change Social Security, right? You can't include other random things in there. We're not going to have a pork barrel bill. Essentially, is supposedly what the Byrd Rule was for, right? And in 1987 or 1990, I can't tell which, I saw conflicting dates, they made that permanent. They said, hey, this is a permanent rule now. Only federal budgetary concerns are going in reconciliation bills. That's what we can pass with 51 votes. That's it. As you know, that's been followed all the time, right? So, who is going to enforce the Byrd Rule? How do we know what's budgetary and what's not? So there's this position called the Secretary of the Senate. And I believe it came from 1796, super old position in the Senate. And their job is to generally be the Secretary of the Senate, right? Take notes, update things on procedure, generally be the Secretary. It's a very old position. We've had it for a super long time. The current Secretary of the Senate is Jackie Barber. She was appointed by John Thune just recently, and she is from South Dakota, actually. South Dakota is a lot of nepotism and buddy politics in South Dakota, in case you didn't know that. But Jackie Barber appointed to the Secretary of the Senate. And the Secretary of the Senate is an appointed elected position. So, usually the majority leader is gonna, pick the person and the Senate votes to confirm, and that's how you pick the Secretary of the Senate. Now, in 1935, they established this position called the Senate Parliamentarian. The Senate Parliamentarian serves under the Secretary of the Senate, and it is an appointed, non-elected, bureaucratic position. And the Senate Parliamentarian's job is to enforce parliamentary procedure, right? They enforce all this stuff. One of the things they do is they enforce the Byrd Rule, and they decide what counts and what doesn't count as a budgetary, concern or budgetary thing that deserves to be in a reconciliation bill. Now, the current Senate Parliamentarian is Elizabeth McDonough, who was appointed in 2012 by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. Harry Reid was a Democrat and led the Senate at that time, and he appointed this person. Now, this position is usually appointed by the Secretary of the Senate, but in practice, right, the Senate Majority Leader has a lot of pull here. If your boss's boss comes to you and tells you to do something, well, you're going to do it, right? And if your boss comes to you and says, hey, you need to fire that person or you need to appoint this person, well, again, you're going to do it. And practically, that's how this works here. The Senate Majority Leader can tell the Secretary of the Senate, because both of these are not termed positions. They're not elected. They serve at the pleasure of the Senate, which means they can be ousted anytime. So the current Senate parliamentarian is some person that was appointed by a Democrat. Now, these positions are supposed to be nonpartisan. But if you've been paying attention to politics for the last 20 years, you know that nothing in America is nonpartisan. There's no such thing. So you have a Democrat-appointed Senate parliamentarian that still is there, even though the GOP has been in power for 6+ months. John Thune bothered to appoint the Secretary of the Senate, but somehow he thought leaving that in place was a good idea. So you have what I can only assume is a partisan Senate parliamentarian in there who looks at the Byrd Rule, uses it as a way to remove from the reconciliation bill something that would give you more rights, and thereby strikes it down. This mess is the way that the Senate makes laws. As you can see here, you have an appointed, unelected official who's in charge of deciding what doesn't get included in a bill. Essentially, they have veto power over reconciliation bills. And of course, as always, it's applied selectively, right? So in my lifetime, we've passed I don't know how many omnibus bills, and no one has ever come out and said, hey, well, wait a second, that's not a reconciliation bill thing. We'll just keep it in there, right? These things are notoriously full of horrible pork. Meanwhile, in the same bill, the big, beautiful bill in right now, they're going to still, they have a provision in there to sell off federal land in the West. That apparently counts as federal reconciliation. They also have the deal with Palantir in there. Palantir? I'm pretty sure that's how I pronounce it. In there as well, which is a pretty massive domestic spy network AI thing that's going to give access of all of your data to the government and tie it together in one big, beautiful database so the government can track you better, right? So you have the Senate parliamentarian leaving those provisions alone, no problem. But when it comes to your gun rights, those get struck out of the bill. We have enabled this random, lowly, appointed, bureaucratic, non-elected position to have veto power over laws for the entire nation. This Senate parliamentarian, by the way, makes $216,000 a year. They make more money than senators. So this is a highly paid position that has veto power over laws in the country. The President of the United States makes $400,000 a year, as far as I know. That might have been updated recently, but I don't think so. I think it's still $400,000. And they have veto power over laws. But also, you have a little sub-president hidden away in the Senate that can veto things out of a bill. How do we get in this mess? Comes through this long history of understanding how the Senate makes up their own little rules, which to some degree makes sense. And then you get reconciliation bills on 51 votes with a random, again, bureaucrat with veto power. So I've belabored this enough. I hope you've enjoyed this journey down how screwed up is U.S. government, because it's pretty bad. So if this makes you angry, it should make you angry. Your elected officials actually don't have the power. They've given away their power over time and over history to actually make laws. And now we, you and me, are at the whims of this random person who the Senate Majority Leader can't bother to suss out. And now this bureaucratic position contains more power, gets paid more money than your senators. The more you know. Do brave deeds and endure.